Hello, everyone. Good evening, and welcome to another Holocaust Educational Trust Film Club edition. It's really nice to see you all. My name's Ben Fuller. I'm an educator at the Holocaust Educational Trust, and I'm coming to you not from my place in North London today. I'm coming to you from up in sunny Scotland. I'm visiting a friend and doing some work from home from here, so slightly different background to mix it up a bit for you today. It's really good to be with you and talk about this week's film, which is Ida. We'll talk more about that momentarily, go into some detail, but I just want to welcome you all and remind you who we are. The Holocaust Educational Trust is a UK-based charity with the aim of bringing Holocaust education, consciousness and understanding to people from all walks of life right across the UK. And we do that in a variety of ways, primarily through schools and universities, but in the community in any way that we can. And if you ever want to learn more about the Holocaust, and do get in touch with us, visit our website www.het.org.uk to find out more, or keep up to date on the socials like here on Facebook and Twitter, where you get up-to-date information on everything that we're up to. Really worth following. So today we're talking about the film Ida, which was released in 2014. It's a foreign language film. It's in black and white, so hopefully that didn't switch too many people off from the get-go. When I was a young lad, never liked the foreign films, never liked the black and white. But this is a really interesting film. We're going to try and get stuck in some of the issues and some of the kind of concepts and challenges that it presents us as we think about this history. And it does so in a really subtle way, which gives more questions than answers, I'd say. So I think we have to kind of acknowledge right from the start this is going to be a different kind of film club, because the film is not thrusting stuff to us to challenge or discuss. Rather, it's thrusting stuff to us to consider, to think about, and ponder and interpret a lot. So I'm going to kind of offer some of my own interpretations, I think, as we go through this session. But I'd really love for you guys, having watched the film, to add your comments and your interpretations, particularly if you disagree with what I think, which is probably no bad thing. So I'll get stuck into sort of the overview of the film, and then we'll have a look at some of the themes and some of the emerging challenges that it seems to present, or certainly has presented me in preparing for this afternoon. I really think it's a real thinker, and I've really enjoyed kind of grappling with what it's trying to say, partly because I don't think it's specifically trying to tell us anything exactly. Rather, it's trying to kind of give us things to grapple with. So yeah, it's been a fun job doing that. So this was written and directed by Pavel Pawlikowski. It came out in 2014 to a very, very positive critical reception, winning no fewer than 67 awards, including Oscars, Golden Globes, BAFTAs for Best Foreign Film. Pawlikowski himself is Polish, which is where the film is set, although he spent most of his life and working life in the UK and produced films in English. But he returned to Poland for this film, and very much kind of saw it, from what I've read about, as a kind of an opportunity for himself to explore his own heritage as much as the heritage that is discussed in the film. It's not a true story, although it is it is based on very loosely. The character of Wanda is based on a real life person who was a resistance fighter and subsequently went on to become a judge in the Soviet Union in Poland. But we'll come more to that later. So just to start with, let's go over the synopsis and just remind ourselves what happened in the film, and then we can start to unpack it from there. So we meet our main character right at the opening of the film, who at this point is known as Anna, although we later find out her real name, her birth name is Ida, and she's in a convent in somewhere in Poland, in a very, very rural area. She's just coming up to the point where she's going to take her vows to become a fully fledged nun and commit herself and her life to faith, prayer, and the church from here until death. So it's a pivotal moment in her life, and right from the get-go. She speaks to one of the senior nuns in the convent, who tells her that she must go and visit her auntie, who she doesn't really know, one time before she can take these vows to commit her life to the convent. And this is the start of the journey. And in this conversation, she's very bluntly told, well, you're a Jew. You were born Jewish. So instantly we realize that we're dealing with someone who doesn't know their own heritage, who has to now go on a journey of discovery. And so she leaves the convent and goes and finds her Aunt Wanda, who is as far removed from her own lifestyle as it's pretty much possible to be. So her auntie is, well, certainly was a very committed communist, who was formerly a judge, and alludes to the fact that she was involved in some high-profile cases as a prosecutor as well, and worked on some kind of key and important show trials that involved sending men to their deaths, she says. So she's from that perspective, she's very different, because whereas Ida is a person of faith, Wanda is a person of ideology, you might say. Wanda also is clearly someone who is after her career, something that is in the past. She's now someone who's kind of trying to live life in a somewhat hedonistic way. I think there's a lot of drinking, there's promiscuity. She has a sort of carefree nature, but a very serious nature, a very stoic nature. And stoicism is something that I think that comes across right throughout the film. And that's one of those points of intrigue where I think that this is a real representation of Soviet culture. Perhaps an exaggeration in some ways, but it's bringing across this idea that in this time and in this place, people are not open with their feelings, open with their thoughts, and as such, the film is as much about what's not said as what is said right throughout. So Ida goes to visit Wanda, and having just found out that, she knows that she's an orphan. She knows that she's been in this convent as an orphan, but she doesn't really know much about her family. She's just found out that she's Jewish, and she's asking Wanda to give her some help in discovering her heritage, really. And Wanda explains to her that her parents have died, and that they were murdered in the Holocaust era, in World War II. I've noticed that in everything I've read, it refers to them being murdered in World War II, as opposed to specifically the Holocaust. And I think that one of the interesting things about this film, like some of the others that we've looked at, is it would be hard to call this specifically a Holocaust genre film, but it certainly speaks to the Holocaust, and the Holocaust is fundamental to the story, even though it's not particularly discussed throughout the narrative. It's just implied, it's just accepted, and again, it's something that the film does in a really interesting way, that it doesn't overly explain anything. It doesn't sort of patronize the audience with trying to sort of square every corner and explain all this stuff. It just says, okay, this is what's happening, and this is where they are. It very much, there's no flashbacks, there's no kind of precursors. It's just the journey from that moment. So Ida and Wanda go on this journey. Some would describe it almost as a road movie, where they're getting to know one another while they go on this journey of discovery of their family's past. And before they go, Ida's shown some photos, and there's a little boy in it, and Ida thinks that she has a younger brother, and Wanda says, no, you didn't have a younger brother, but we don't learn anything more about that yet. And they go to a village in the Lublin area of Poland to find out what happened to their parents, to find out how they died and where they were buried, and find some sense of closure, I guess, in terms of what took place there. And what they find is that they're going to get doors shut on them, that people don't want to talk to them about what happened to their parents. They appear to know certain amounts of stuff, and there is an interesting scene right at the start where they go to the house where they used to live, and the family denies all knowledge of their existence, and assumes that they are essentially coming to try and reclaim their property, which isn't actually what's happening. But interestingly, is a comment on what does take place in Poland even till today. I remember a few years ago I was in Poland myself with a group, and we were in a village in a rural part of the country, and we were sort of told by our guide, do be aware that you might get some dodgy looks, because people sometimes think that you could be Jewish people or representatives of Jewish people that are coming to find old property and reclaim it, and there's a sense of anxiety around that even to this day. So that's what they're experiencing, this kind of, we don't really want to know you because you might have a history that impacts on my life right now, and I don't necessarily want to give that up. I think I've chatted with a few friends and colleagues about this, and there's a kind of air of an unspoken anti-Semitism that exists here as well. And again, the context of the film in 1960s Poland, in Soviet times, where religion, having faith and living faith is it's certainly seen as negative. It's certainly not part of the Soviet ideology, and it will have a negative impact on your own sort of life chances if you choose to live that faith. So perhaps that's to do with it. Perhaps there is this anti-Semitism. It's worth, reminding ourselves that even after the Holocaust, under Stalin in the Soviet Union, the Jewish people were heavily persecuted. And so all of these things are kind of just simmering under the surface of the narrative of the film, and implied in various different ways. And so as they go and try and discover their past, they come up against brick walls, and they seem to either have to sort of ask very direct questions of people, such as, where my father is buried, tell me and show me, or ask very vague, roundabout questions that allude to something, but without giving too much away about who they are, because they know that is going to lead them to a blank response. So there's an interesting comment about the space and time that the film is set there. Eventually, they do locate their house. We've already got to that part, but they manage to get hold of basic kind of. They push the owner of the house into a situation where he says, okay, if I'll show you where they're buried, just promise you don't try and take the house. And that says, again, that reminds us what the big anxiety is, and it raises the questions around how far anti-Semitic feeling, I think, is a deeply present and felt and held belief, or how far it's just about self-preservation, this kind of ambiguity and seeming certain dislike of these Jewish strangers who are coming into town and asking awkward questions. I haven't mentioned a subplot, which is that Wanda is kind of encouraging Ida to think about her life choices, is suggesting that taking these vows of chastity and everything that goes with it to enter the church could be a mistake. And she sort of says, how do you know what you're sacrificing until you've experienced it? So there's this very sort of coming of age moment for Ida, or period for Ida, where she's having to work out who she is, what she is, where she comes from, what does she believe, what does she stand for, what is life going to be for her. Meanwhile, Wanda's who's a character who seemingly has left her past behind her. Once the Holocaust is over, once the war is over, she's thrown herself into communism and found family and a sense of loyalty there, where Ida's had no choice but found her family in the church. So these are two people who are on a self-discovery voyage, coming from very, very different backgrounds, but having to face up to the past that either they've denied existed, or kind of left behind them, or that they've just realized is part of who they are. And I think that's a really powerful thing. And along the journey, they come across a young man who they pick up, who's a saxophonist, and Wanda seems to encourage Ida to sort of talk with him and hope that might kind of loosen her up a bit and introduce her to secular life in a new way, and some kind of sexual reawakening, or awakening, I should say. So eventually, back to the main plot that we want to talk about, they are taken by the son of the father, who they believe certainly helped for a period, but potentially in the end killed their parents. And he says, I'll take you to their grave as long as you don't try and take my house. So they go along, and he finds the exact spot. He digs up the grave, and they take the bones away to be buried in a Jewish cemetery. Come to that moment in a minute. And in that moment, the son confesses that he's the person that killed the family, and that the other young boy who Ida had spotted in a photo, it turns out he is in fact the son of Wanda. So she's had to revisit this part of her past, which she's obviously tried very hard to avoid thinking about for very many years. So, and this kind of brings them together in a new way, because all of a sudden Wanda has a vulnerability, and Ida is the compassionate kind of shoulder to cry on, and I think that's quite an interesting sort of narrative sort of prop for the film that helps to bring them together. So after this sort of discovery, they take the bones to a Jewish cemetery. I think interestingly, on the journey, Ida mentions perhaps we can get a priest to come to do some kind of funeral, which I wonder is part of her inability to accept and sort of really comprehend what her heritage is, that she's not thought, well, we should get a rabbi, we should get a priest. And they go to this Jewish cemetery, which is absolutely derelict. It's overgrown with trees and plants, which is what Jewish cemeteries in Poland often look like. It's worth remembering 90% of the Jews of Poland were murdered during the Holocaust. So synagogues that were destroyed weren't rebuilt. Cemeteries are not kept because there's no one there to keep them, because there's no one there to rebuild these communities and rebuild the specific buildings that we're talking about as well. So there's an interesting little comment on Jewish life in Poland through that scene. I think that it is something that's kind of in the past, and nature has kind of taken over those spaces. So having done this, now Ida's confronted with, well, she's done what she set out to do. She's discovered who she is. She's discovered her family, and she's going to go back to the convent. And Wanda once more sort of tries to encourage her not to do that, to live in the outside world. And when Ida says no, she's going to go in, and then decides that she's not quite ready to take those vows. Meanwhile, Wanda goes back to her home and commits suicide. And you know, again, there isn't a clear explanation for this, but it's something that the film that she does. My feeling, and this is my interpretation, is that there is a sense of, okay, I've lived my life. I know where I've come from. It's come back to me. I remember the friends that I was watching it with, we were discussing whether this was her sort of, in a very strange way, her happy ending, that she'd done everything she felt she needed, and so she was ready to no longer live, or whether it was a question of her inability to come to terms with that past, and therefore, you know, her being racked with guilt that she'd left her son behind, wondering what she'd gone to fight for. All of these kinds of things come out and do pose us with some really difficult questions. And like I say, the film doesn't really tell us any answers. Ida, meanwhile, comes back into the city, reconnects with the young saxophonist, and sort of completes, I would maybe say, her that sexual awakening, experiences life in the outside world, and in that kind of period after they've come together, the boy says, now, you know, what next? And she slinks off. Her what next is that she slinks off, leaving him behind, and goes back to the convent. And again, there's big question marks there. Is this a retreat for her, or is this a proactive move for her? And I think that is really open to interpretation, whether she's deciding that the Christian Catholic convent life is for her, or whether there's too much for her to discover and she just doesn't know really who she is. What is her identity outside of that space? So the safest thing she can do is retreat back into that space. And I genuinely don't have an answer to those questions, but they very much come out for us to think about. I'm just going to skip across to some of the comments that you've made before we go further into any kind of analytical stuff. That interestingly, the comments have all been really, really powerful, really positive about the film and the way that it's moved people. Jerry says, Outward 2010 says, feelings portrayed in this film ranged from pain, anguish, loneliness, sadness, desire to find truth, resilience, abandonment, reconciliation when finding the grave in the wood, love and tender feelings for her aunt, connection, safety, conclusion. The only one I would question is conclusion now. I mean, I suppose there is some sense of, well, now you know, but it feels very open-ended to me. But Jerry says it's a very moving film, and I think many of you will agree. Who else are we looking at here? Malcolm Green says it's one of his top 5 films, and the performances are immaculate. The cinematography is exquisite, and I really would agree. I think as a sort of artistic spectacle, I think it's a wonderful watch, and really, really, really interesting to just see that kind of a film. It's not the norm. It is sort of, I don't like the word, but it's kind of arty. The camera angles, all of that kind of stuff is portraying, and I believe that the direction there was to be not normal, to do something that did encourage the audience to engage in a slightly different way, and I think it does that really well. So yeah, the comments have all been really positive, but we are left with these interesting things that we have to grapple with, and I'm going to come back to this question that isn't really asked within the film, the question of why. The question of why were the parents killed? We know that they were being protected for a time, and then they are eventually murdered by this very same family that they've been protected by, and I think that's kind of that leads to some serious questions. And in conversation I've had with friends and colleagues, my interpretation of that, and this is where I'd really love to know what you think, is I wondered if, we need to get our heads into the context of Poland during the Holocaust, where we've already talked about, and we know that there is anti-Semitic feeling in that part of Europe, but we've got a family that are protecting a Jewish family. We know that the consequences for Polish people who did protect and resist against the Nazis were quite simply death. And not just necessarily death for the person who was protecting, but their family would be gone after as well. Incidentally, that's not necessarily the case right across the board. So in places in Western Europe, consequences for protecting and hiding Jews were considerably harsh, but wouldn't be to that level. So there's an interesting thing going on there about that we can just sort of pick up on briefly, on how in different parts of the continent people were treated differently based all on Nazi racial ideology. The way they saw Western Europeans and Eastern Europeans was different from their racial point of view, and that affected behaviours towards them. So my kind of feeling is that the question is, did the son actually do it? He might be taking the blame for his father in this moment for one reason or another. My interpretation, for what it's worth, is that I wonder that in that climate of absolute fear and knowing of the consequences of being found out, the son took an executive decision for his family out of self-interest and self-preservation, maybe out of some anti-Semitic belief, but maybe not, to do this to get his family in the clear. Maybe to get hold of the property. Maybe his motives were more cynical than I'm sort of crediting him with. We don't get to know the answer to that question, and I think that is one of the difficulties with this history, that there's so many unanswered questions. There aren't the witnesses either willing to speak or alive to be able to unpack this. Talking of witness and willing to speak, the character of Wanda is a really interesting example and something for us to consider, certainly in the context of the Holocaust Educational Trust, where we have so many wonderful survivors who come and speak about their experiences in schools and universities and in communities across the country. For every survivor that is willing to speak, there's many others that are not, for whatever reason. And Wanda is someone who has decided, whether it's because she doesn't feel comfortable with it herself, whether it's because the society doesn't want to know, there isn't a great deal of sympathy. So in the Soviet Union, once the war was over, anyone who was a victim was not classified by their ethnicity, their religion, anything like that. They were just simply victims of fascism. So what voice and what channels Wanda had to speak about her experience would have been very, very limited. So she brought into communism, and she had been a resistance fighter, and that was going to be how she lived her life as a communist, rather than in light of her own sort of personal family experience. And I think that kind of stuff really raises some challenging questions for us about how lucky we are, for the one, that we have people that are willing to tell their story and are able to tell their story, but also those people that are able to tell their story, tell it because they know it. And in Ida's case, she didn't know where she was from. She didn't know the background of her life. She didn't know anything about her family. All she knew until the very beginning of the film is that she was an orphan who had an aunt who didn't want her. So she's a reject, and she has to come to terms with that. And through the film, she's coming to terms with it to an extent. But I do feel in her character that she's somewhat overwhelmed by that as well. Okay, where else do I need to mention here? Oh yeah, so just one final bit on survivors is how in this story we've got survivors that can't piece we've certainly got one survivor who doesn't know her past and can't piece it together. It's worth mentioning, I heard a survivor last year in Israel who knew quite a lot about her story, but didn't know some of the key details, particularly around her own family. She was someone who'd been passed into a Christian family to be in hiding during the Holocaust, and then was adopted by a Jewish family who really neglected her as a child, and landed in a kibbutz in Israel and was essentially abandoned to the kibbutz. And so she very clearly said, I've lived a life where I don't know who I am. I don't have a sense of identity. And that's the reality for many people. And I think it's possibly something we don't get the opportunity to discuss, certainly in the classroom, because we rely very heavily on eyewitness account, on testimony, on survivors, that almost we can forget that there's so many pieces of the puzzle that just will never exist to be placed in and to see that whole picture. And I just think that in a way this film just reminds us of some of those things. In terms of the classroom, just to kind of bring it around to a sort of educational sense, it's not a film that we would recommend as a kind of learn about the Holocaust through the film Ida. It's not giving us much teaching about the Holocaust, but in terms of teachable moments, for want of a better phrase, then there is this question of identity and the orphaned Jewish young woman who doesn't know her background. Interestingly, I wonder if anyone else spotted this. There's a picture of a very, very famous Jewish rescuer of Jews who wasn't Jewish herself, a woman called Irina Sendler. At the end of the film, Wanda is putting together a kind of montage of what we seem to think are family photos, and one of the pictures is Irina Sendler. I don't know why that's there. I'm not sure why that picture is there, because Irina Sendler is someone who lived in Warsaw. There's been no reference to any kind of connection to her, but Irina Sendler was someone who helped 2,500 Jewish children escape from the Warsaw Ghetto, and as she did so, she collected the details of their family so that those children would know where they came from eventually, once the war was over, once they were safe again, and they were placed into homes where the kind of surrogate or foster parents or adoptive parents were trusted that they would tell the child what had happened to their parents eventually. So it's interesting that Irina Sendler pops up in the film, and it does help us to kind of look at that juxtaposition, where Ida doesn't get have that fortune to know about her family. The cemetery is another really interesting sort of moment in the film that again just would I think we could use that in a way in a way to learn about the impact, the presence of absence that the Holocaust created in so many countries across Europe. And the other thing that is worth maybe just picking up on is the killing site itself. This family was killed not far away from their homes, not by the Nazis themselves. It was local people who they knew intimately well, who eventually murdered them in pretty much their own property, and all that comes with that. Again, it just encourages us to think about the Holocaust in those wider ways than just automatically going to the camps and the kind of very systematic narrative that we're used to. And I think that's of value in this film. I'm just going to read a couple of the comments that have coming in. I apologize that I haven't got some already. So Alison Hume says, I like the film, very accessible, very watchable, unlike many Holocaust films which are very long, like Sharon Schindler's List. Yeah, it's only 1 hour and 22 minutes, which is remarkably short, and I've got to say it doesn't feel that short. It feels like there's a lot more going on, but yeah, it is. It's kind of snappy in that sense, even though feels quite slow paced and calm and quiet and sort of distant. There is a pace to it. Also, it wasn't extensively discussed, but I think it's notable and important that the Polish Legion were mentioned, albeit briefly, as Poland have a very complex relationship with how they're viewed as victims or perpetrators, collaborators, etc. Yeah, really good point, Alison. There was a section of the Polish community that really didn't like the film because it felt that it was portraying Polish Catholics as anti-Semitic and Polish people generally as perpetrators, and decides not to kind of get into the complexities of that relationship between non-Jewish Poles and the Holocaust, which, you know, we know there is a huge amount of resistance, but there was also no shortage of collaboration and perpetration from within the Polish community itself. So yeah, it doesn't pick up on those things, but it does kind of give a bit of a nod. Melissa says it's emotional, but in an understated way, without really doing much. As in, you can get a sense of the gravity of what's been lost, but normal life continues alongside it. So a sense of dissonance. And I think that's a really great point, Melissa. The sense of, okay, we know what's been lost. And I wonder again if this is a comment on the sort of Soviet lifestyle of that there is particularly Polish Soviet lifestyle of, you know, this is a country, a nation that has been through horrific rupture from World War II, and then with Stalinism coming in, that has lost so much. So there's almost a sense of, well, okay, you lost a lot, but so have I. So why should I care about your loss? And anyway, we don't talk about that, and all of those kinds of things, and that sort of distance that people put them between themselves and the reality of where they're living, and that very tight-lipped nature of those communities that comes through, and so it is about what's unsaid rather than what's said, and I think that really does come through in the film, and it is very powerful without having to explain everything. But you know, the kind of Hollywood model of filmmaking is, we're going to make sure that you know what we're doing. When we do something subtle, we'll explain it in a minute, we'll tell you what that means. But this film really doesn't. There's so many things going on under the surface, and I think that's really an important point to pick up on, and thank you for raising it. Steve says the whole film raises interesting issues regarding the role Poles played in the murder of the Jews. They were obviously victims of the Nazis, but perhaps also perpetrators of the Holocaust. I was also very interested in the choice of music, classical as well as live jazz. The jazz seemed to be a way to bring modern Western culture into Ida's experience, part of her experiencing the world before taking her vows. Absolutely. Interestingly, if you watch the film again, you'll notice that there's the only music you hear until the final scene is music that the characters are hearing themselves. There is no musical soundtrack except for that last scene, and so all of that music that is played, very deliberate. And I think the contrast between, I think where the jazz comes in is part of that sort of journey of discovery for Ida, and it again says something about about the culture of the time, that it existed, but it was very much in the background. The fact that the saxophonist is trying to hitchhike to a gig. It's obviously not well paid work. He's obviously not doing a great thing out of it for himself financially, but it's a love of music. And that's another really interesting thing about this period of history, where if you wanted to kind of break from the norm, then you'd have to do it in a way that was sort of self-sacrificial. So yeah, and as a part of Ida's experience of becoming who she is to become, or finding herself, then yeah, I think the jazz is usefully there to kind of challenge her ideas and concepts. Okay, I think I'm going to leave it there. There's as ever, there's many other things I think that we could pick up on. I think that each of the two main characters are really, really fascinating, and their own personal story could take up an hour of discussion and thought and writing and all the rest of it. But as ever, we've overrun a bit. I don't know what we should be doing in terms of time anymore. It feels like 35 minutes is not even that long anymore for these things. But really, it's a really interesting film. For what it's worth, I loved it, and I'm looking for. I'll watch that again and sort of try and look for more sort of little intricacies and subtleties that give us more clues. But it's a really great film for very subtly, in a very understated way, pulling out some really key points in that post-Holocaust world, particularly in the Eastern European post-Holocaust world. Okay, so next time we are going to continue with our post-Holocaust sort of theme, as it were, but in a very different way. We're going to look at the film Denial, which came out, I think, in 2016, and everything that goes with that. So I believe it's on Netflix, so if you're a subscriber to Netflix, then you can get it for free, as it were. If you're not, then I'm not actually sure exactly where else it's available, but it's widely available, and it's a very interesting film that certainly unlocks the door, if not tells us the whole story of this process of Deborah Lipstadt, her book, and having to deal with the problem of denial that still unfortunately exists in the world around the Holocaust. So have a good watch of that. I'd love you to send more comments in advance, or join the conversation as we go during the session in a couple of weeks. And until then, I hope you have a lovely, if for the teachers and students that are watching, lovely remainder of the holiday, fantastic start to the new term, and I'll see you all in September. All the best, guys. Take care. Thanks a lot for being here. Bye-bye.